This is the story of an ancient curse that marked the destiny of an Irish family. Not just any family, but an entire clan people devoted to faith, working in the fields and caring for livestock on the lush hills overlooking the River Lagan, where Belfast stands today. Their life flowed peacefully. Together we'll discover how fragile the human soul can be, vulnerable to feelings of envy, resentment, and a thirst for revenge, even toward those we love. Misunderstandings and silence can allow these feelings to fester like poison ready to erupt in actions that leave lasting scars. Though time may soften them, some scars are unforgettable. The story we share today is rooted in distant centuries, revealing that these emotions, so present even today, have shadowed humanity since ancient times. To understand their true nature, we must look back, discover where it all began, and trace its evolution toward the end of a dynasty. You will witness human fragility, envy, resentment, and the desire for revenge that can arise, even if the people involved are loved and cherished family members. Sometimes these feelings grow silently due to misunderstandings affecting those closest to them. Lack of communication amplifies these latent emotions, and the mind, swayed by fate, may lead to rash actions that leave an indelible, unforgettable mark, even if softened by time. Life will no longer be the same, and relationships between once loving people will inevitably change, even if everything seems to carry on as before. Yes, time will be our best ally, temporarily helping us forget what happened. Our story begins long ago, as a testament that this virus of resentment and revenge, still relevant today, has been alive and well for centuries. To understand our tale, we must turn back time, discover its origins, and seek to understand how it evolved to bring about the end of a lineage. It is March in the Holy Land, in southern Lebanon, year 1272 AD. The last crusade has now ended with nothing achieved, and the crusaders are preparing to return to their homelands. They had come to the Holy Land from every kingdom in Europe, driven by faith and adventure and convinced by the lies of the preachers of the time, who promised anything to convince them to leave. Almost always second-borns from good families, born without any expectation of inheritance, who had left their land and a quiet life to demonstrate their value in the Holy War. Their father, fully determined not to divide the property into too many small plots, used to leave everything to the firstborn. The Ninth Crusade had also been a failure. The enthusiasm of the previous crusades was waning, and fewer young people were willing to go to the Holy Land, and the Holy Sepulchre was still firmly in the hands of the infidels. The armies of the Crusaders were retreating, and the echo of their footsteps resounded within the walls of Acre, a city that would now have surrendered to fate. The Christian soldiers, exhausted and disappointed, walked through the ruins, dragging with them heavy armor, dented shields, and the lost gaze of those who have seen and lived too many illusions. They had fought, they had sacrificed themselves, and thousands had died in the name of an idea or the name of Christ. But they had not made it, and there was nothing left but to return home for those who could afford it. But despite everything, they were forced to fight again, but to defend themselves from the attacks of the Mamluks of Baybars, their leader, who after having resisted their assaults for 2 years, now knew that they had won and tried to do them as much damage as possible, so that the news that the survivors would spread upon their return home would discourage others from embarking for the Holy Land in defense of the Holy Sepulchre. That was their land, their homeland. They would never leave, and they were ready to defend it to the death. Many young people, after all the preaching they had heard and that had convinced them to leave, were sure Jesus Christ was on their side. He was with them, and they could only win and liberate the Holy Sepulchre in a few weeks. Many, bold and drugged by these sermons, were convinced they would go and return in a few months, and since Christ was with them, this was a guarantee of victory. Many had been fooled by these false preachings, but they had discovered it too late, only when they had their first clashes with the Mamluks. Thus they discovered that even the Crusaders, supported by Jesus Christ, died in battle, and it was not at all true that they would win easily. The weakest and most unprepared for arms fell by the thousands in the bloody clashes of the last 2 years. Those who had deserted and returned to their homeland convinced the others not to leave and told of the false preaching, the hard life, and the thousands of young people who had died in vain to liberate the Holy Land. It was all a hoax. Nothing of what was preached was true. The infidels were very well prepared and well-armed warriors, and there were many of them all ready to defend their land from the invasions of the Crusaders. The enthusiasm for the Crusades ended up dissolving, and the Ninth Crusade was officially the last. But although it was technically over, as mentioned, people were still fighting to sell their skin dearly, but above all to be able to bring it home. Many, with economic possibilities, had already embarked, and many, without any possibility of embarking, were still defending themselves from the continuous attacks and skirmishes that broke out here and there on the plain. Elvin Kelly, a man with a sun-scarred face with ice-blue eyes that reflected both pain and determination, was among these desperate men. He had fought for 2 years for nothing, and now did not have enough goods for a safe passage aboard the last ships preparing to leave the Holy Land. He was tired of this life of constant armed clashes to defend his life, and decided to change area. He had nothing to lose. He thought that no one at home was waiting for him, so he decided to head south, to Acre, now known as Acre, near modern-day Haifa, in the coastal plain region of the northern district of Israel, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, at the mouth of the Naaman River. Acre was the last remaining Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land and would resist for another 20 years. But it needed men ready and willing to defend it, in exchange for food and a place to sleep. The fortress of Acre would fall about 20 years later in 1291, when the Mamluk Sultan Khalil laid siege to Acre, the last Crusader outpost. The city fell after 43 days of resistance and the massacre of 60,000 prisoners. Khalil continued his conquest of Palestine, erasing every trace of Crusader rule.
I'll accept the offer made by William of Clermont, Marshal of the Hospitallers. While waiting for a new opportunity to return home, I'll be satisfied with a makeshift settlement.
He took his horse, so strenuously defended from the hungry hordes who wanted to cook him, harnessed it and loaded it with his personal effects and a few others that he had gained as spoils of war in the sorties made against the infidels, but always of little value. He put his weapons in the special case, hung the heavy shield and helmet on the side of the horse's saddle, leaving the sword well within reach. He filled a goatskin with fresh water and slowly, zigzagging through the confusion and utter commotion, left the port of Tyre, still in the hands of the Crusaders, but which was about to be besieged by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars and headed for the stronghold of Saint Jean d'Acre. He had set off along the coast, much safer than the hinterland, where the Mamluk troops maneuvered and bands of knights roamed in desperate search of Christians. He felt the sea breeze caressing his long reddish beard and his disheveled blonde hair. He watched the waves crashing on the shore and thought of his home, of when he spent his days playing near the sea with his brothers. Slowly he could still imagine their faces and hear their voices. He missed his home, he missed his loved ones terribly, he missed his mother and father, but deep down he wanted to see his brothers again right away. He sighed deeply to stifle the emotion that was blocking his throat, and he was even more sure that sooner or later he would return to Ireland. He spurred his horse and convinced him that it would be better for both of them to arrive at the stronghold before sunset, to avoid unpleasant surprises. Mary, Thomas's wife, also came out onto the porch, looked at her husband with infinite sweetness, and although worried about her son Elvin, she hugged her husband and reassured him that she was sure he would return, and she also remained for a moment to stare at the road. The Kelly family, united by ties of blood and mutual love, lived a simple life made of sacrifices and hopes. Every gesture, every look seemed to speak of the resilience of a clan that, despite the difficulties, found strength in its members and its values, certain that one day she would be able to embrace her beloved Elvin again. S3. Media. Worried father looking at road, hopeful gaze in rural setting. I'm sure he will return. Narrator. The old father calmed down a little, but as he had done every day for a few years now, he couldn't stop staring at the road that led to their farm there, all the way to the end where it turned and disappeared behind the hill. His Elvin would come from there and welcome him with open arms. James reassured him again, gently caressed his shoulders and went back to shearing the sheep that would keep him busy for a few more days. S2. Media. Man shearing sheep, medieval sheep shearing. I'm sure Elvin will come home. He loved him, they had grown up together and he was sure that one day he would come back. Narrator. Media. Man looking wistful, missing family member. He had been gone for 6 years now, and apart from some news that had arrived in the early years through the merchants, he had heard nothing more. The last crusade had ended more than 2 years before, and they still didn't know anything about Elvin. S2. Media. Father and son in conversation, medieval family discussion. I know, Dad, he'll come back. Narrator, life continued as usual among the green Irish hills. The Kelly clan was busy shearing the sheep, and it was an almost ritual event. The shepherds gathered them carefully, speaking softly so as not to disturb the flock, and with wise and decisive gestures they began to shear the wool white and soft as snow. The wool, once collected, was entrusted to the women who spun it with patience and dedication. Each thread represented a part of the life of the clan, woven with love and effort, and with it were created the sweaters and fabrics that would warm the bodies and hearts of the Kellys during the long Irish winter. The women, all wives, sisters, and daughters, united by blood ties and in their long wool skirts, gathered in the farmyard or in the house next to the large fireplace on the coldest days, chatting while they spun the wool embroidered or at the loom, produced the fabrics for the clothes of all the members of the clan, and overcame the boredom of the dark winter days. Other members of the clan were busy with livestock, which was another important resource. The cows provided milk, which the women skillfully turned into butter and cheese, essential to the clan's diet, and valuable in barter with the merchants who occasionally stopped by the farm to buy local delicacies. The horses, strong and sturdy, were the real pride of the Kelly men. Each animal was cared for with almost reverential dedication. They were cleaned, fed, and galloped every day. Life was mostly peaceful except for the odd disagreement between the men that almost always ended in a general brawl, then drowned in a pint of ale and some light dressing, but everything returned to normal. The porch of the main house was where the family gathered during breaks. James, the eldest, often sat there watching the comings and goings of the shepherds and the calm that enveloped the surrounding fields. Beside him, his father Thomas rested, his gaze turned to the distant hill. Even though his face showed the signs of aging, his eyes still shone with the hope of seeing his son Elvin again.
Two long years had passed since I had said goodbye to the stronghold of Acre. 2 years of endless waiting, dashed hopes and frustration at every missed opportunity to embark for my homeland.
Then suddenly an unexpected turn of events presented itself to Elvin. A place on a departing ship had become available, and not just any place. It was the passage for Sir William, the deputy of William of Clermont, a dignitary of the court of Edward I of England, crowned king only a few years earlier, in 1271. The news of his sudden death had left Elvin speechless, but that tragic event, paradoxically, finally opened the way for him to return.
William of Clermont, knowing that I was looking for a ship to England but did not have the funds to pay for the passage, gave me the place of the deceased Sir William. Also, as compensation for the impeccable service I had provided in defense of the stronghold in recent years.
They had been at sea for over a month now since Elvin had taken leave from the service. They had stopped in Malta to stock up on water and food, and had stopped for a few days to replenish their supplies and wait to find what they needed to embark.
Now we were about to pass the Pillars of Hercules, and I was impatient to finally reach London. I would continue by any means north towards Scotland, and then I would embark for my beloved Ireland.
The sea journey was long and full of dangers, and the crossing forced Elvin to face the sea and the uncertain fate that awaited him once he disembarked. Every wave that crashed against the ship was a reminder of his turbulent past, a past that, as much as he tried to push away, crept into his days like salt that crept into his wounds, burning.
The days spent on board were filled with a single image: the green hills of Ireland, the house abandoned in the grip of youthful anger, and that discussion that still resonated in my memory like a regret, difficult to chase away. I wondered what they would think of me, what they would say when I reappeared after so many years. But every doubt was dispelled by the same thought. The house was waiting for me, and nothing in the world would be more important than my return.
How many times had he regretted that discussion? How many times? But now it was done, and he was returning home. He had forgotten everything. Older, with more experience and practicality, he was ready, if they had welcomed him back among them, to help his entire family.
I had with me a great surprise, which I'd kept hidden all that time. No one had noticed, and I had never spoken of it. The person who gave me this special object made me swear that never, neither I nor any of my family, would reveal to strangers, to anyone else outside of the family, the value and supernatural powers of that object.
The person who gave him this gift was a Mamluk officer who had been seriously wounded in battle and, believed to be dead, had been abandoned by his men. While searching for survivors, Elvin saw him, took him to his camp and cared for him, saving his life. Arrival in London.
He had never seen England from the sea and was amazed to see from afar all those white cliffs. But when they told him that he was home now, he understood that that was his homeland and he cried with joy.
They arrived in London in the evening and then he finally landed. He knelt down, thanked God for having returned, and kissed his land. How beautiful it was, and how much he had missed it. He stayed in London for a few days to recover from the oscillations of the ship to which he was now accustomed. He looked for any means of transport that went north and found a small caravan of acrobats who toured England from castle to castle for their shows, and he joined them.
He would work with them to pay for his trip, and since the Crusaders were very famous at that time, and Elvin was a Crusader and still had all his armor, he would perform during the shows.
It was not easy to adapt to the new life, but the desire to return home was strong, and he accepted everything, committing himself to giving the best of himself. The journey was not as fast as Elvin would have liked, but after all, he was getting used to that gypsy life and he liked to show off at the court of the lords of the time.
Elvin talked about his life, and that of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, of the bloody clashes with the Mamluks, sometimes even exaggerating, but no one ever paid attention. They were all eager for news, and these occasions were the only ones to be informed of famous facts that had already happened. And then the news brought by Elvin was fresh. He had just returned from those places only a few months ago.
How many times was he forced by pressing requests and deafening whistles to repeat and describe in more detail the scenes of the clashes on the field of the Crusader army, or of the duels fought lightly with the Mamluk knights-errant who desperately hunted Christians for their military career? How many times did he tell of the ambushes that were set for him at every step, even by shepherds and caravan drivers, apparently busy with their work, but ready to immediately unsheathe the scimitar as soon as you were within range?
How many times did he have to defend himself again during the shows? From apparently drunken soldiers who challenged him to a duel and blinded the fight, convinced that after defeating him, they would inherit the fame that had accompanied him.
Yes, it was certainly not an easy life for Elvin, not even in his beloved homeland, but always remaining alert. He endured everything, while the journey slowly took him further and further north, towards home. The journey continued, and Elvin also managed to put aside a decent nest egg, the result of gifts that the lords kindly gave him. Small things, but added up. From castle to castle, they had become a decent little treasure that would have allowed him to buy a horse and pay for the crossing.
Summer was coming to an end, and they had reached Newcastle on Tyne on the east coast of England, the last stop on their wanderings. Winter was not far off, and the little caravan would be stopping there for the winter.
After the last show, Elvin reluctantly parted from them, who had been his temporary family for a few months. There was no shortage of pats on the back, handshakes, and farewells. Farewell to Lucille.
With tears and deep regret, Elvin bid farewell to Lucille, his unexpected and temporary companion for the journey. She was the widow of one of the entertainers, killed by a stray arrow fired as a joke during a performance at Luton Castle the previous summer. When Elvin arrived, she welcomed him into her tent. A widow with no children, alone and defenseless against various abuses, she saw his arrival as a miracle.
She was not very tall, with blonde, tangled hair due to the lack of a comb, a luxury item in those days. It was clear she had once been beautiful, though signs of aging had begun to show. But perhaps because her work as an entertainer kept her body slim and toned, within a week with Elvin she began to blossom again, taking extra care with her appearance. Lucille knew the journey would eventually end, and Elvin would leave to return home, yet her desire to be with him was so strong that she suppressed this truth.
Elvin, not accustomed to having a woman in his life, grew fond of her, and since his arrival, no one dared bother her. They shared unforgettable moments and nights, and Elvin cared deeply for her.
But now the time for decisions had come. He approached her, held her tightly, and asked her to follow him to his home. They were happy together. Why stop dreaming?
Lucille was prepared for this question and told him she couldn't join him. He had a future, one she couldn't be part of.
Lucille's despair?
A dear friend of hers who could foresee the future had told her, and even if reluctantly, for Elvin's sake, she would stay to spend the winter in Newcastle. She loved him too much and wanted only the best for him.
Elvin tried again to convince her to follow him. He loved her too and would always keep her with him, but Lucille was adamant.
She hugged him and kissed him for the last time and ran away crying desperately. Her life would go back to being hell, but for Elvin's sake, she would accept him again. Elvin felt a strong pain and got drunk on sadness. With the regret of love, the first of his life, he slowly went away, leaving behind him perhaps the greatest regret he had felt until that moment. He would have all his life to regret her. The next day, Elvin bought a sturdy, good-sized horse, fully equipped, mounted it, and rode northwest, casting a last glance behind him in the vague hope of catching a glimpse of Lucille. Using an ancient military road built centuries before by the Romans, but still perfectly passable like all Roman roads of the time, he spurred his horse towards Scotland. Elvin's return.
Autumn was fast approaching, and with it the first cold that kissed the Irish land, bringing with it the scent of an impending winter. It was now the end of October, and the sky was increasingly covered with grey clouds ready to pour snow on the fields and hills.
On the Kelly clan farm, life continued as usual, but the air was filled with a silent tension. The constant wars in Europe and the incessant need for soldiers had pushed the rulers to forcefully conscript all the available men they could find. Bands of recruiters sent by the crown went around frantically looking for men to enlist. Those who resisted were arrested and deported, and in exchange for freedom had to enlist in Her Majesty's army. Those who had cattle had to hand over 20% of their animals to the crown, and if they were horses, they had to give half. In exchange, they received a promise of payment called IOU, but most of the time, given the high rate of illiteracy, these were just words that mocked the unfortunate, while the real receipts were then presented by these evil and corrupt officials to enrich themselves unworthily.
Fear had spread among the men of the clan, worried about having to abandon their families to fight a distant war. Some of them had taken refuge in the woods to avoid the recruiters, while others had accepted the difficult decision to hide the cattle in the new underground stables built among the hills. These secret shelters, camouflaged among rocks and vegetation, were the only hope to protect the herd and the small fortune of the clan. They had also organized lookout shifts to spot anyone approaching the farm in armor and on horseback. The women would soon replace the men as they hid in the woods surrounding the farm.
The men stayed away from the farm and returned only towards evening, while the women were busy but happy to contribute to the success of what they had planned to save their husbands, brothers, and children, and with them all the animals. November arrived and brought the first snow that would prevent any movement of the crown soldiers, at least until late spring, when the thaw would begin. The men prepared to return home and continue their work as they always had.